And the history of the northern kingdom is very sad because Jeroboam was bad. His son was worse. I believe his son was assassinated. And the guy that took over was even worse. And then King Omri had a son named Ahab. And Ahab was the worst of all. Ahab and Ahab had help. Now, if you're looking for baby names, and if you decide that you like a certain name, I suggest that you find out where it came from, okay? Especially if it's from the Bible, because there's a lot of good people in the Bible that we should name our children after. And there's a lot of bad people in the Bible, and their names are supposed to live on in infamy. You know, you wouldn't name a little boy Hitler, right? And so it'd probably make a great first name if it wasn't for that one historical figure, you know. But shoot, most people are nervous around the name Adolf. That's bad enough. I mean, you know, I think we'll go with Bob. So if you're going to have a little baby girl at some point in the future, all right, Jezebel is one of the names to avoid, okay? I kept my mouth shut around a little girl I met named Delilah, but Jezebel is a name to avoid, okay? The King Ahab of Israel, he's descended from a long line of stupid and evil, and he does something worse. He goes north to the Sidonians, very big, important port city north of Israel. It's been there for ages. I think some version of it is still there today just because you just have to have a city there in that location. And he goes to the Sidonians and he marries their princess Jezebel, brings her down, and she brings the god Baal and the goddess Ashtoreth and everything. They're building temples and they're consecrating priests to these false gods. She had like 850 priests, 400 for Baal, 450 for Ashtoreth or Asherah. I'll get those. I'll say both those names, but it's just the same name from two different languages. And they make a mockery of God's nation of Israel. Ahab is the bad guy. So what comes on the scene? Elijah the Tishbite, Elijah the Gileadite, Elijah the prophet of God. Now I want you to understand, most people think that miracles happen all throughout the Bible. And there's a lot of miracles in the Bible. We believe in a God of miracles. Amen? We believe in a God of miracles. But I got news for you. Miracles are not all over the Bible. If you think about the stories we've been having, Moses parted the Red Sea, and that's been hundreds of years ago. Since then, God has brought about miraculous victory in battle. But that's really not the supernatural miracle making like we the odds were against us, but we fought hard and won. There have been a few miracles along the way, but if you lived back then, you didn't see a miracle every day. You probably might not even live long enough to see a miracle in your lifetime. And many of the prophets, they're just preachers and writers, and they go out and they preach you need to repent. God says you're messed up. God says He's going to take away His protection from our nation if you don't quit screwing around, if you don't quit taking advantage of the orphan and the widow, and if you don't do all these things, if you don't put away your foreign wives. And so most of the prophets are just preachers, really. And there's supernatural element to that. But along comes Elijah, and this guy does a miracle just about every other day. God drops a nuclear bomb on Israel and the corruption that is in the system there, and there's like a whole group of prophets. Other prophets are mentioned. There's 100 prophets not even mentioned by name. There's just that was like one of the career paths at their high school or something. I want to be a prophet, and they just go, and I don't even know how that works, but Elijah shows up, and he comes to the palace. We don't even know his lineage hardly. We think he's an Ephraimite, but he goes to the palace, and he's just this wild, he's the burning bush. He's got the burning bush in his eyes, or something like that. That's just the impression. The Bible doesn't say that. Don't think that's in the Bible, but you just get the idea. Here's this wild man. And he just shows up, and he doesn't care if you're king. He doesn't care how powerful you are. He doesn't care if you're holding a sword to his throat. He's going to tell you exactly what God said. He only fears God. And Elijah comes to Ahab, and he says, you've messed up. Everything I've already said about Ahab. It's not going to rain until I say. And then he leaves. And lo and behold, farmers, I want you to think about this. It doesn't rain for 3 years. It doesn't rain for 3 years. And God guides him to the brook Kidron, and he is able to drink water from the brook, and the birds bring him meat and bread in the morning and in the evening. And God takes care of him while he is in hiding. But it doesn't rain for 3 years, so eventually the brook Kidron dries up. And one of the biggest ironies of this whole story is God then sends the man of God to the Sidonians. He goes to Zarephath. Sidon is a big city. He goes to Zarephath. It's a village within the territory of Sidon. And he knocks on the door of a widow, and he says, I'm the man of God. God led me to come here. And what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to give me something to eat. And she says, well, I don't care if you're the man of God or not. I got a little bit of oil. I got a little bit of flour. I was just about to mix those together to make bread so that my son and I could eat our last meal and die because of this terrible famine that's going on. And Elijah said, you know what? You feed me first, and you watch what God does. And sure enough, in faith, this pagan foreign woman makes him bread instead. And her and her son must have sat there and watched him eat it. Can you imagine? And he eats it. And he goes, now, go fix something for yourself and your son. Boy, these Israelites are dumb, aren't they? I mean, I told him that was my last stuff. But she goes back to her jug, goes back to her flower pot. There's still stuff in there. So she makes bread for her and her son to eat. And they never ran out. The miracle of God, they never ran out. And he stays there for a long time. And at one point, this poor woman's son died. And she's all upset and comes to him. Why, a lot of good your God did, feeding us when we were hungry just so my son could die later. You know how people get, right? And you'd feel the same way. I would. We all blame God when bad things happen, right? Because He's in charge. So He either did this or He at least let it happen. Why would He do this to me? Elijah's upset too. He says, give me the boy. And he takes the boy upstairs to his room, lays him out, and he's laying on him 3 times and yelling for God. Please, God, these people have shown kindness to me. Don't treat them like this. Don't let this happen to them. And he begs God to bring life back into the boy. And the boy comes back from the dead. In the Old Testament, when miracles are not an everyday thing, but they kind of are when Elijah's around. Time is up. Finally, God says, I think Ahab's had enough famine. Go see Ahab. So Elijah shows up. Ahab and one of his courtiers had taken their horses or their mules or something out to find grass. We've got to find grass for these poor animals somewhere. Elijah shows up to the servant of the king and says, go tell your master I'm here. And this guy goes, please, don't you know I'm really on your side? Please, 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 don't do this to me, Elijah. Haven't you heard that I hid 100 prophets from the king and his wife and fed them bread and water in the caves where I hid them? If I go tell him that you're here, he's been searching every country. He has sent dignitaries to every country saying, I will give you so much money if you can find, he's been looking for you everywhere. And when I tell him you're here and I come back and God's carried you off to somewhere else, he's going to kill me. And Elijah swore to him, as the Lord lives, I will stand before King Ahab today. So that satisfied this guy. I think his name was Obadiah. I don't think he's the same Obadiah prophet that wrote a book of the Bible. But anyways, he goes and he gets King Ahab. King Ahab says, is that you, O troubler of Israel? Isn't that just like people? We do something bad. And when punishment comes, we think it's the punisher's fault. Right? It's the cop's fault. It's the judge's fault. It's the state's fault. It's my school teacher's fault. No, it's not. It's your fault. Repent. Ahab says to Elijah, is that you, O troubler of Israel? Elijah goes, I'm not the one that has troubled Israel. That would be you. How long will you lead Israel to worship two gods, Baal and the Lord? Let's settle this once and for all. You tell all Israel, we're going to meet on Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel was a very lush place. Might have even still had some green on it even after all this famine. We're going to Mount Carmel. It's a high place. Someone had an altar to the Lord there at one time. They weren't supposed to, but they did. And you bring your prophets of Baal, and I'm going to bring the Lord, and we're going to see who Israel should be worshiping. And so all of Israel gathered on this mountain. And the king was there, and Jezebel, that awful woman, was there, and her 400 priests of Baal and her 450 priests of Asherah were there. And Elijah said, you guys go first. What we're going to do is we are going to sacrifice an animal, a bull, on your altar to your God. You could put wood on there. You can put the dead animal on there. You can do everything but light it yourself. What I want you to do is I want you to call on Baal to light his own sacrifice. If he's a god, surely he can do this. And so there's 450 of us. Surely he'll hear us, right? So the priests of Baal, they build an altar and they bring in firewood and they kill the animal on the altar and they start to dance around it. Oh, Baal, hear our cry. Oh, Baal, come light this sacrifice. Show these Jews how stupid they are. Or I don't know what they said, but they just, whatever it was that they did. And they're dancing and they're calling on Baal, and this goes on for quite some time. And I love Elijah. Maybe you guys need to yell louder. Maybe he's asleep. There's actually one very modern translation that has Elijah going, maybe he's on the toilet. Maybe. The previous translations had kind of glossed that over in the Hebrew. Maybe he's on a journey. Maybe he's on a journey. Maybe he is old and deaf. Maybe he cannot hear you. And he's making fun of him. And to be Elijah. That would just be so much better than all the politically correct landmines we have around here. I tell you what Elijah would say about this. Well, that'll just get me in trouble. Maybe you need to shout louder. Maybe he's still in bed. And this goes on all day. I mean, in the ancient world, they didn't have where to be anyway. So this goes on all day. Dancing around this sacrifice, shouting, screaming, and chanting. And it gets so... Now, this is very interesting to me. When they wanted their God to know they were really serious, when he hadn't heard them all day, they start cutting themselves and mutilating themselves. This is what pagan worship is like, people. I want you to understand, we have this idea today that, okay, the major religions of the world are Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, maybe Hinduism, and so, it doesn't matter what religion you are, just be a good person, because Judaism has a very high code of morality, so we like them. A lot of the Islamic people, when they're not radicalized and trying to blow us up, they have a very high code of morality, so we like them. And they make good neighbors, and they're very, and the Hindus and the Buddhists, everybody got into Buddhism in the 60s, the Beatles were Buddhists, so it's okay. I mean, it's just, and we have this very cosmopolitan idea that, well, it doesn't matter what religion you are, just be a good person. And it was a little more obvious back then. I'm going to maybe get myself in a little bit of trouble. You have no reason to be a good person, or even have an idea what being a good person is, when you worship the wrong God. Okay? Our God gave us the Ten Commandments. Our God created Adam and Eve as a man and a woman, and that sets the stage for the rest of human history. And when you ask God, so why do people get married and have kids? Well, because when I made the first man and woman, I had them get married and have kids. And that's why and that's all the Bible says. That's why we do it. That's how God created the world to work. And so our understanding of right and wrong, we've kind of imposed on everybody else. So now that you can have moral people who are atheists or all these other things, that's fine. I'm not going to say that the next time you meet someone who's not a Christian, they're an immoral person. I'm not going to say that. There's a lot of very moral people that are not Christians. I'd trade some of you for him. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just... And but you don't have a reason to when you don't worship the God of the Bible. And these pagans that lived around Israel, you think, oh, they kind of want to worship their gods. What's God so uptight about? What's the big deal? Well, number one, God is at the center of the universe, and so if you're not worshiping Him, you're in rebellion. Number two, worshiping other gods leads to those gods telling you to do all kinds of terrible things like mutilate yourself, cut up yourself, to show them that you're serious, and also child sacrifice and sexual immorality and everything. All kinds of things were involved in the pagan practices of old, and our society is surprisingly going back to all those things, even though it'll call itself atheist a lot of times, but you see all those practices come back. Oh, sexual immorality, self-mutilation, and all kinds of terrible, and the breakdown of the family and everything else. Interesting. But when they got no more blood to bleed and they got no more voice to shout with, they're done. The priests of Baal are done. And so it is Elijah's turn. And Elijah goes, this is a high place. They kind of thought the gods could hear you better on a high hill or something. So people even built altars to the one true God on these high places. Elijah went over and he repaired one that had been broken down, had been not in use for a long time. And they brought the firewood. They brought the animal. And they killed the animal. And Elijah gave a very strange command, especially during a famine. And said, all right, I want buckets and buckets and buckets of water. And I want you to dig a trench. While they're going to get water, you boys dig a trench around this altar. And so they sent for water, and they're digging this trench, and they get the water there, and they pour enough water over this bull and over this firewood that it runs down into the trench and fills up the trench. And then Elijah prays. And he doesn't have to shout. He doesn't have to jump around. He doesn't have to dance. He just prays, Lord, please light the sacrifice so that this is a paraphrase, so that everyone in Israel will know that you are God. And fire falls from heaven, and not the kind of campfire you make. This is the kind of fire that can burn wet firewood, a wet bull, and lick up all of the water out of the trenches. And all the people that are gathered there, they fall to their knees and they're bowing to the dirt and they're yelling, the Lord is God. The Lord is God. And I know that this offends our sensibilities, but when Elijah, who just called down fire from heaven, says, kill the priests of Baal and Asherah, everybody grabs a sword and grabs a priest, and they kill them, by God. They execute them. They're not going to mess around. We're not going to make God angry with us anymore. And I imagine Ahab himself was a little intimidated. And Elijah has a conversation with Ahab where he says, I believe I hear the sound of rain. Why don't you, and he tells him, get in your chariot, head back to your palace so you can beat the rain before it starts to fall. In a weird series of events, Elijah girds up his loins and beats Ahab back to the capital city on foot. I'm not sure what the point was in that miracle, but I don't know. Or maybe he just knew the back trails. I don't know. But, and he sends his servant to the top of Mount Carmel, and he says, I see a cloud the size of a man's hand. Well, that's where we're getting our rain from, buddy. And that cloud grows, and it turns gray, and the storms come. Now, that's an impressive scene, right? God sends fire from heaven, defeats all the priests of Baal, priests of Asherah. Jezebel is a true believer. She doesn't care what the God of Israel did to prove that He was the one true God and that Baal was just a stone statue. Word comes to Jezebel about all that had happened. Apparently she wasn't there that day. She sends word to Elijah. May my God do also to me, unless I make you like those priests that you killed on that day. My goodness. Woman, pay attention. Your God is not the real God. He's not going to protect you. You should be afraid of Elijah. Nope. Somehow, Elijah is still afraid of this woman. I don't know, probably because he knew he wasn't the one that called down fire from heaven. He knew God sent it. So he knows he's not strong. But he runs. He decides it's time to go back into hiding. And he runs and he meets a man who turns out to be an angel. And this man says, you got to get up and go. God wants to talk to you. Here's bread. Here's some other food. You need to eat this. You need to keep your strength up. And he's probably stressed out in the kind of mood where he doesn't want to eat. But the angel's like, you eat this, and you eat this right now. He eats that food, and he gets back to going on the run, and he's on a journey. On the strength of that supernatural food, he goes 40 days. And he gets out to the wilderness. The Bible is specific. I forget exactly where. And he's ready to hear from God. And I'm going to get these out of order. There was a great wind, a terrifying, gushing wind, blow you off the ground kind of thing. He hides from it. God was not in the wind. There's a terrific fire that goes through there. God was not in the fire. There's an earthquake. Surely that's the voice of the Lord. God's not in the earthquake. And then there's a still small voice. Elijah, what are you doing running from this woman? And Elijah complains to God. They've killed all your prophets. Everybody wants to worship Baal. I'm the only one left that cares anything about you. This is what we call preacher syndrome. Actually, it's what we preachers call Elijah syndrome. God, I don't know why you had me come to this church. They all want to live pagan ways. That I'm the only one that cares anything about you. Me. Elijah, God explains to him that there are 707,000 people in Israel that have never bowed the knee to Baal. And he says, I want you to anoint the next king over Israel. He's going to lead a fight to kill Ahab and take over Israel. Hopefully he'll do better, but he probably won't. And I want you to go find Elisha. Thanks, God, for putting those two next to each other in the history, so we can constantly get Elijah and Elisha mixed up. And you will anoint him to be the next prophet after. He gives him all these instructions and tells him to quit crying. There's no crying in prophecy. How many of you people remember this movie? There's no crying in baseball, right? There's no crying in being a prophet. Get up. Go do all this stuff. And Elijah is faithful, so he does. He has many adventures. Elisha has many adventures. But unfortunately, the northern kingdom of Israel continues a downward slide towards unfaithfulness towards God. And eventually, located right north of them is the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrian Empire harasses and raids them several times before they finally just come in and utterly conquer everything and carry everybody off. And they bring other people into the land and they mix. And they kind of have the religion of the Lord, but they kind of have all this pagan stuff mixed in. And even from the beginning with Jeroboam, they had erected a golden calf. So their religion was never very pure to begin with. And at some point in the future, it becomes the territory that Jesus and his disciples knew as Samaria. And that's the long history. It's why they didn't like Samaritans. Samaritans are half-breed by blood, and they're half-breed in their religion. They're not really the people of God. We are, and they say that they are, but we are as Jews. And all of that bad blood that was between the Jews and the Samaritans. It all goes back to that there. And there were many of the prophets whose names you know. They weren't to the southern kingdom of Judah. They were to the northern 10 tribes, warning them, turn back. Don't be sinful. Don't worship other gods. Turn and worship the one true God, or God is going to destroy. God is going to destroy the land of Israel, and he's going to let you be carried off into captivity. And they didn't, overall, they didn't listen. There were a few times where they listened, but overall they didn't listen. And so I want to extend the same message to you. The Lord is very patient. He waits for hundreds of years for Israel to get its act together. He waits hundreds of years for Judah to get its act together. He waits before that when he's talking to Abraham and says, I'm going to give your descendants all of this, but I'm going to give the people who live here hundreds of years to get their act together, to worship me, or at least to stop killing their own children and child sacrifice and all of these other terrible things that they're doing. But I'm going to give them 400 years, and they're just going to waste it. I'm God, I know everything, so they're just going to waste it. And I'm going to bring your descendants back here to destroy them and take this land from them as a judgment upon them. God is very patient. We look at the times that God destroyed whole cities or nations or something like that. We think, wow, God sure was angry back in the Old Testament. No, God's still angry today, but He was always patient. He'll wait hundreds of years for a people to turn around, and He'll wait for you to turn around. And He's waiting, and He's waiting, but there's a point of no return where God says, you've had your chance. You've had your chance. Of course, He's not going to wait hundreds of years for you because you are not going to live hundreds of years. But He gives you this chance, and He gives you this chance this morning that you would turn away from what you enjoy right now, from the things that God doesn't like, the things that are sin, but we want them, we love them, we think they're great, we think they're going to provide something for us, some wonderful joy, some wonderful sense of belonging, and yet we need to give those things up. Or maybe we're stressed out, we've been trying to pay for our sin in our own way, and when we do that, if I could just be a good enough person, what we're telling God is, I don't need your grace, I don't need Jesus' sacrifice, I just need to be a better person. Even that is rebellion against God, because you can't be a good enough person, number one. And number two, God has made a way for you to be forgiven of all the things you've ever done. And so rely on that. Don't try to fix it yourself. Don't have the pride that says you can fix it yourself. Be like the people of Israel. Understand today that you have seen that only the Lord is God, that there are no other gods, and that you want to worship only Him. Be like Elijah. Be faithful even when it's hard, even when it's difficult. And turn to the Lord today.